Chapter 1. The Last Train. The night on the windy line descended slowly, as if nature itself was unwilling to hurry. The cold wind rattled the old station structures, making the weak lights on the platform flicker and sway. Every flicker seemed like a warning, though most passers-by ignored it, attributing it to the usual hum of the wind. The old rails beneath their feet creaked as if groaning under the weight of the approaching winter. Train No. 47, nicknamed over the years as the Windy Express, stood ready on the tracks. The driver, a middle-aged man named Artyom, checked the instruments with habitual meticulousness. His hands knew every button and lever, every indicator light and dial. Over the years, he had seen a lot, but something about this night felt different. Perhaps it was the wind, or perhaps a premonition he had long learned to ignore. The first carriage was nearly empty. A few late-night passengers quietly made their way to their seats, as if sensing the long journey ahead. Among them was the businessman Viktor Petrovich, an elderly man with a weary gaze, gliding over the worn walls of the carriage. He carried a briefcase that, as would later emerge, contained documents capable of upending someone's life. Beside him sat a young family mother, father, and a teenage boy named Sasha. Their trip was ordinary, yet tinged with unease. The boy kept glancing nervously at fleeting shadows in the glow of the lights. In another carriage was a researcher named Elena. She had just returned from an expedition to a remote region, studying rare plants. Her camera and notebook were filled with notes and photographs. She looked up and noticed the flickering reflections of the lights on the metal walls of the carriage, as if trying to warn her of something. The train began moving exactly on schedule at 23:15. The screech of wheels against rails set a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm, while the wind whistled in passengers' ears. On the station where their journey began, it seemed as if time itself had slowed. Old buildings, remnants of a bygone era, stood like silent witnesses to centuries gone by. Artyom carefully monitored the control panel. Everything appeared normal, yet a brief, almost imperceptible signal flickered on one of the gauges like a shiver through the wires. He chuckled softly, blaming the age of the system. But something tightened in his chest. Outside, the wind was picking up, and the train gradually gained speed. Inside the carriage, the air grew heavy, as though pregnant with tension before a storm. Passengers exchanged quiet glances. Some read books, others simply stared out the windows, where dark trees and the rare village lights passed by. Elena opened her notebook and began documenting how the lamplight reflected off the rails. She felt an odd tension, as if the train wasn't merely traveling along the tracks, but carrying its passengers somewhere unknown. She lifted her camera to photograph the reflection and at that moment felt a cold draft. Though the windows were shut, a faint, almost imperceptible screech echoed through the carriage. Passengers frowned momentarily. Artyom raised his head and squinted into the darkness ahead. The rails looked straight and familiar, yet something in their shine made his heart tighten. He felt as if the tracks were subtly bending, as though the road itself was guiding the train. Through the fog and darkness, a figure appeared. It stood at the side of the tracks, motionless, like a statue carved from stone. Artyom blinked, trying to focus, and the figure vanished. He didn't even have time to discern whether it was a person or merely a trick of the light. Meanwhile, Sasha pressed closer to his mother. "I see something out there," he whispered. His parents exchanged worried glances, but said nothing. Children often invented stories on nights like these. Yet Elena noticed how tightly the boy clenched his hands and decided to quietly keep watch. The wind intensified, and the train began to sway slightly. Artyom checked the instruments again and again. Everything seemed in order, but the inner voice wouldn't let go. He remembered the stories old drivers told about the Windy Line, a train that moves at night, sometimes guides passengers to places from which no one returns. As the train picked up speed, the air in the carriages became thick, almost tangibly tense. People began to whisper softly. Elena noticed the reflection in Viktor Petrovich's eyes, anxiety hidden behind a mask of indifference. She realized that none of the passengers sensed the true scale of what was approaching. And in that very moment, when the fog wrapped the line like a dense blanket, the train began to tremble slightly. The screeching grew louder, as if the rails themselves were protesting its movement. Artyom felt mounting pressure on his chest, as if the train resisted his commands, like the tracks themselves wanted to guide it into the unknown. Passengers still had no idea that ahead awaited not just an ordinary night, but a series of events that would change their lives forever. Every sound, every shadow, everything would matter, even what seemed coincidental. And so began the night on the Windy Line, a night that promised trials, secrets, and fears the passengers would remember for the rest of their lives. Chapter 2. Before the journey, the night had deepened, and the station lights flickered weakly in the wind, casting long shadows across the empty platforms. Each flicker of the old lamps seemed to stretch time, making the night feel endless. Inside the train, passengers were settling in, but none of them felt the night was ordinary. Viktor Petrovich adjusted the strap of his briefcase. He was used to traveling at night, but tonight his mind wandered. The documents inside the case were sensitive, possibly explosive if they fell into the wrong hands. He tried to focus on the rhythmic sound of the train wheels, letting it soothe his racing thoughts. Yet, even as the familiar hum enveloped him, a subtle unease prickled the back of his neck. Something felt off, not a sound or a shadow, just an intangible sensation that whispered of coming trouble. Sasha, the teenage boy, was restless. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the carriage window, peering into the darkness. Outside, trees flew past like dark, silent sentinels. "Mom, do you see that?" He whispered, pointing at a flickering light among the trees. His mother, weary from the day, shook her head softly. "It's just the wind, darling," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. She felt a subtle tension in the air, a quiet warning she couldn't name. Elena, the researcher, sat her day with her notebook open. She had spent weeks in remote regions, studying rare plants, but nothing in her fieldwork had prepared her for this oppressive atmosphere. She noticed patterns in the flickering lights outside, shapes that seemed to move intentionally, almost as if the shadows themselves had awareness. She took out her camera, but the screen went black the moment she tried to capture the reflection. Her heart skipped a beat. Something about this line tonight was extraordinary, but not in a way she could explain. In the back carriage, a solitary traveler, an elderly man named Sergei, hummed a tune quietly to himself, attempting to maintain a semblance of calm. He had taken this line many times before, but tonight even the hum of the train seemed irregular, broken by sudden creaks and subtle vibrations that felt alive rather than mechanical. The wind outside intensified, whistling through the gaps in the old metal station and along the rails. The train began to move with a soft, insistent vibration that resonated through every metal panel and wooden floorboard. Inside, passengers instinctively drew inward. Conversations became quieter, almost conspiratorial, as if the train itself demanded silence. Sasha's father leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's probably nothing," he said, though his voice betrayed doubt. He looked at the map of the line printed on the carriage wall, tracing with his finger the path ahead. This route, it always felt a little strange, he admitted in a low voice. Even as he spoke, he realized he wasn't sure if he meant the whirring bends of the tracks or something else, is something intangible lurking in the wind. Elena noted every small detail: flicker of lights, the irregular hum, the shifting shadows outside. She felt a growing sense of anticipation. She began writing observations in her notebook, documenting every anomaly. The perception of reality is fragile, she whispered to herself. Even the most ordinary journey can hide extraordinary events. Meanwhile, Artyom, in the driver's cabin, was adjusting dials and checking gauges with meticulous care. Yet every now and then, his eyes flicked to the fog rolling along the tracks ahead. It was thick, unnatural, and seemed to cling to the rails like a living thing. His heart rate increased subtly. He had driven this line countless times, but tonight, he felt that the rails themselves were watching, waiting. As the train picked up speed, the vibration intensified, and the passengers felt it not as movement, but as a presence pressing against them from every angle. Viktor Petrovich shifted uncomfortably in his seat, gripping the briefcase tighter. The family glanced at each other nervously, while Elena continued to observe, her eyes wide, every nerve alert. Suddenly, a low metallic groan echoed through the carriages. Heads turned instinctively toward the source, but there was nothing, no break in the tracks, no obvious cause. The sound had the weight of inevitability, like a warning that could not be ignored. Sasha pressed closer to his mother, whispering, "I don't like this. It feels wrong." Elena glanced at the boy and realized he wasn't imagining things. The atmosphere in the train was charged, almost sentient, and every passenger was beginning to feel it in their own way. Even Sergei, who had always remained calm, now hummed more quietly, his fingers twitching nervously on the armrest. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and in that instant, shadows danced across the walls, as though the train were moving through more than just fog and darkness. Shapes emerged for a fraction of a second, figures that seemed human, but impossible to identify. Everyone noticed, yet no one spoke, afraid to acknowledge what they had seen. Artyom's hand tightened on the lever. The pressure on the rails felt heavier, almost conscious. His instincts screamed at him to slow down, but the train pressed forward relentlessly. Outside, the trees leaned and bent with the wind, and distant lights flickered, creating illusions that disoriented the mind. The tension built slowly, invisibly, yet palpably. Every passenger felt its weight of anticipation, the silent knowledge that something extraordinary, something dangerous, awaited them on this night, and no one yet realized that the ordinary journey they thought they were on would soon turn into a test of survival, courage, and sanity. Thus, the night deepened further. Each moment stretched into eternity, and each shadow, each flicker of light, seemed to whisper secrets that would only reveal themselves as the train advanced into the unknown. The windy line was alive tonight, and it had chosen its passengers carefully. Chapter 3: Wind and Fog. The train pressed deeper into the night, and the fog grew thick, curling around the rails like a living, breathing curtain. Shadows of twisted trees stretched across the windows, warping into monstrous forms that seemed to move when no one was looking. The rhythmic hum of the train vibrated through the carriages with a low, menacing undertone. Every passenger sensed an unspoken warning that the night was far from ordinary. Viktor Petrovich sat there rigidly, gripping his briefcase tighter. He was accustomed to late-night journeys, yet tonight the sensation pressing at the back of his neck was unlike anything before. Something intangible seemed to guide the train, an invisible hand that forced a knot of unease into his chest. Papers rustled in his briefcase as if echoing the tension around him. Sasha pressed against the cold glass, peering into the fog. "Mom, I see something," he whispered. His mother squeezed his hand, attempting reassurance, yet her own unease betrayed her. Shapes flickered at the edge of sight, moving in the fog, vanishing the moment anyone tried to focus. Even she couldn't tell if the movements were real or illusions, but instinct screamed danger. Elena, notebook open, documented everything. Flickers, the strange vibrations, the uncanny movements outside. Her camera refused to operate whenever she tried to capture the shadows. The fog seemed alive, bending reality around the train, distorting perception. It was subtle at first, a shadow here, a movement there, but each anomaly chipped away at the sense of ordinary life. In the driver's cabin, Artyom's eyes scanned the rails. What had once seemed familiar now appeared alien. The small deviations of the tracks from earlier had grown, tugging the train slightly, almost deliberately. He adjusted levers, but the train shivered and groaned, reluctant to obey. The hum of the engines had an odd undertone, a resonance that felt intentional, like a silent warning. A sudden metallic screech echoed, cutting through the hum. Heads turned. No one could pinpoint its origin. The sound was not from wheels or rails but deeper, resonating in the chest, vibrating with an almost conscious force. Viktor Petrovich clenched his fists. Sasha clutched his mother. Elena's pen hovered in midair, flouncing with awareness. The train's rhythm now felt alive, unpredictable. Outside, the fog thickened, blurring trees into monstrous silhouettes. Figures seemed to emerge from the haze, vanishing when anyone tried to focus. They were tall, formless, indistinct, and impossible presence that both terrified and mesmerized. Sergei, the elderly traveler, whispered to himself, "I've taken this route hundreds of times. Never like this." The words floated into the carriage air, unnoticed by anyone else, yet pregnant with truth. The train lurched, a sudden vibration rolling through every carriage. Elena noticed objects subtly shifting, books sliding a few inches, bags tilting. Though the train moved steadily, nothing appeared broken, yet the subtle movements unnerved everyone. The line between reality and illusion blurred. Wind gusted through gaps in the old train, rattling windows and carrying strange sounds. Flickers of light illuminated shadows that stretched unnaturally along the walls. Every passenger felt it, the oppressive sense of being observed, a presence in the fog that was not human. Sasha's mother whispered reassurances, but even she did not believe her words. Artyom's pulse quickened. The fog was no longer weather, it was active, interacting with the train, responding to fear, feeding it. The carriages felt alive, vibrating with a rhythm beyond comprehension. Every passenger was aware, consciously or not, that the ordinary rules of reality were slipping. Time seemed to stretch, moments elongated as the train plunged deeper into the mist. Shadows moved in impossible ways, and whispers flickered at the edges of hearing. Each passenger's fear grew, entwining with the environment. The night was awakening, and the windy line had begun to assert its will. By the time the train approached the next curve, the tension was unbearable. Each vibration, each flicker of light, each faint shadow hinted that the ordinary journey was ending. Something extraordinary awaited, something that would test the boundaries of perception, courage, and survival. The windy line was alive tonight, and it had chosen its passengers carefully. Chapter 4: The Catastrophe. Night hides the unseen horrors. The train trembled as it plunged further into the thick fog. Shadows stretched and twisted across the windows, turning ordinary trees into monstrous shapes that seemed alive. The low hum of the engines had a new, menacing undertone, vibrating through the carriages. Every passenger felt the oppressive weight of anticipation, as if the night itself had eyes watching them. Artyom's hands were raw from gripping the controls. Slight deviations in the rails had become more pronounced, and the train shuddered under his command, almost resisting his attempts to steer. Sweat ran down his face as he fought to maintain control. The engines groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed aware of the fear inside the train. A metallic screech suddenly ripped through the night. The train lurched violently, throwing passengers against walls and seats. Viktor Petrovich was hurled forward. His briefcase slipped, scattering papers across the floor. The family clung together, Sasha trembling against his mother's chest. Elena's notebook flew open, pages flapping wildly. Chaos filled the carriages, yet even amid the panic, her eyes noticed patterns, flickers, the shadows, the way the train's vibrations seemed almost deliberate. Outside, the fog had become a living presence. Dark shapes moved with impossible speed and disappeared when anyone tried to focus. Artyom glimpsed a tall figure at the edge of the tracks, standing motionless, then vanishing. He pulled the brake lever, but the train responded sluggishly, its motion unpredictable. The first carriage derailed with a thunderous crash. Screeching metal, broken glass, and the acrid smell of burnt brakes filled the air. Passengers were thrown violently, colliding with walls and each other. The family pressed together, gripping one another for safety. Viktor Petrovich struggled to regain his balance while gathering his scattered papers. Screams echoed as the second carriage began to shake violently. The train continued moving, partially derailed, groaning like a wounded beast. Lights flickered, plunging parts of the train into darkness. Shadows shifted independently, and faint whispers echoed through the carriages, unnervingly alive yet intangible. Elena crawled across the floor to help a young woman trapped under a seat. Each movement was met with violent jolts. Her camera and notebook were useless now. Survival became the only priority. Even so, she observed the strange, deliberate patterns, the way shadows elongated unnaturally, the gusts of cold air that seemed purposeful, the way the fog outside interacted with the train like an intelligent force. Artyom struggled desperately with the controls. The train no longer felt like a machine, it felt alive, reacting to fear, moving unpredictably. Every vibration, every groan, every rattle carried an almost communicative rhythm. The fog outside thickened, obscuring everything beneath the derailed carriages. Figures emerged from idle, indistinct, vanishing and reappearing with terrifying timing. Passengers screamed, but their voices seemed swallowed by the mist. Sasha clung to his mother, sobbing quietly. Viktor Petrovich stared at the shadowy forms, disbelief frowning on his face. Time stretched, each second a long eternity. Sparks flew as wheels struck displaced rails, illuminating glimpses of twisted faces, some human, some not. In the chaos, Elena noticed passengers losing awareness of one another. Some disappeared for a moment, then returned, dazed, speaking in whispered words they hadn't consciously formed. The train's rhythm seemed to invade their minds, bending perception. Reality itself felt fragile. Finally, the train slowed, coming to a partial stop. The first carriage, heavily damaged but intact, held the surviving passengers. Outside, the fog swirled endlessly, hiding the landscape. Bruised, bleeding, trembling, they stared blankly into the mist, unsure of what had been real. Artyom, pale and shaking, unfastened his seatbelt. Is everyone alive? His voice trembled. Elena helped the family to their feet. Viktor Petrovich gathered what remained of his papers, still struggling to comprehend the night's events. The windy line had shown its power. It had thrown them into chaos, tested their courage, and revealed that this was no ordinary railway. It was a force with a will of its own, capable of bending reality and fear. No one would forget the night, the echoes of screams, the whispers in the fog, the flickering shadows, and the unseen figures would haunt them forever. And though the train had stopped, the night was far from over. Chapter 5. The Aftermath. Night hides the unseen horrors. The train had stopped, but the night remained alive, thick with fog and unseen presences. The first carriage, though battered, had held the survivors. Outside, the mist swirled, hiding twisted rails, wrecked train parts, and shapes that might have been human or something else entirely. Passengers remained frozen, gripping each other, unsure if they had escaped or were trapped in a nightmarish illusion. Artyom stepped into the aisle, his face pale and drawn. Everyone, please, stay calm, he urged. Though his voice lacked conviction, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down, heavier than the train itself. He had controlled countless journeys, but nothing prepared him for this night. The fog outside seemed aware, curling around the carriages like a living thing, watching, waiting. Viktor Petrovich collected scattered papers from the floor. Most were ruined, damp or torn in the chaos, but a few remained intact. His mind raced. Those documents had been critical. Now, after the derailment, were what might have seen them. Fear pressed down like a physical weight, leaving him helpless. He sank into a seat, clutching what remained of his briefcase. Sasha's mother held him close, whispering reassurances she didn't believe herself. The boy shook uncontrollably, staring wide-eyed into the fog, convinced the shadows outside were still moving. Elena, observing silently, felt a chill at his words. The night had already proven reality was malleable here. Elena moved quietly between passengers, documenting the aftermath. Pages from her previous notes had been torn, but she recorded every detailed pattern of shadows across wrecked seats, the way fog moved around the train, the faint whispers from nowhere. The environment now seemed alive, bending time and perception, testing survivors' sanity. Sergei, the elderly traveler, sat in stunned silence. He had experienced much, but never anything like this. "I've written this line hundreds of times," he whispered, but never seen this. Even his calm demeanor was shattered. Fear ruled every instinct. The train's engines hummed softly, but vibrations felt deliberate, almost sentient. Lights flickered intermittently, casting shadows moving independently of the carriages. For a moment, everyone frowned, noticing a shape lingering outside a window, a tall, indistinct figure vanishing when anyone looked directly. Artyom paced the aisle, inspecting rails visible through broken windows. The derailment had been severe but strangely contained, yet the line ahead was obscured by fog. For a fleeting second, he swore the tracks curved unnaturally, bending reality itself. He shook his head, had his eyes deceived him? The family whispered, trying to make sense of the chaos. Victor muttered calculations under his breath, figuring the probability of survival. Elena scribbled notes, recording patterns she couldn't yet understand. Sasha hugged his mother tightly, eyes fixed on shapes in the fog, convinced they were still watched. Time passed in distorted stretches. Minutes felt like hours, hours like eternities. The train remained stationary, but the environment pulsed with quiet energy. Low hums and whispers echoed from the fog. Shapes flitted at the periphery of vision. Survivors were trapped in a liminal space between reality and nightmare, unable to discern whether danger had passed or was merely resting, preparing its next move. Artyom, desperate for control, tried restarting the engines. Vibrations underfoot shifted unnaturally, almost as if the train responded to his emotions. A gust rattled the windows, sending shivers through the carriage. Everyone instinctively held on to something. The night was not over. Elena glanced at Victor. His usual composure had vanished. The fog had stripped everyone of certainty, leaving only raw human instinct. Fear, observation, survival. These were all that remained. Sergei muttered prayers. Sasha clung to his mother, and every passenger became hyper-aware of every shadow and whisper. Artyom spoke slowly, trying to reassure them. "We stay together, we wait, and observe." His words hung heavy in the air. No one moved. The fog pressed in, undisturbed by their presence. Every survivor understood the windy line had chosen them not by chance, but to test endurance, perception, and courage. The night stretched onward. The train remained, partially damaged, partially alive, suspended in a realm that bent the ordinary rules of the world. Around them, the fog whispered, hiding shapes that may or may not have been real, leaving survivors to wonder whether they had escaped or merely survived one stage of a greater ordeal. The windy line had marked them. None would ever see the night or themselves the same way again. Chapter 6. Trapped in the night. Night hides the unseen horrors. The train had stopped, but the fog refused to lift. Outside, the world was a white void, undulating with shadows that seemed almost alive. Every passenger felt its oppressive, unrelenting presence pressing in from all sides. Even the wounded and shaken had risen from their seats, as if some invisible force demanded vigilance. Artyom walked the hall, inspecting each carriage. His hands were raw from gripping controls, and his face was pale. "Stay close, everyone," he urged, but the words barely carried over the low hum that vibrated through the train, as if the vehicle itself were alive, listening. The fog outside seemed to move with intention, curling around the train like a predator circling its prey. Viktor Petrovich clutched his briefcase, more out of habit than hope. Most of his documents had been destroyed, yet he could not release them, not now. Something about the night made him believe that the papers, fragile as they were, held significance to the entities lurking beyond the windows. Each flicker of shadow across the fog-filled glass sent a shiver down his spine. Sasha stayed close to his mother, trembling but alert. "Mom, I can hear them," he whispered. His small voice carried a weight far beyond his years. Elena paused to listen. Faint whispers indeed rose above the hum, unintelligible at first, then forming fleeting words, fragments of phrases meant to unsettle. Every syllable seemed directed at the passengers, probing fear, magnifying it. Sergei, who had appeared calm in earlier stages, now muttered prayers under his breath. His eyes darted nervously to the windows, where shadows seemed to converge, to shape themselves into forms he could not name. "It's testing us," he said. "Every one of us. Watch, listen, survive." The words were barely audible, yet they resonated with a truth that could not be denied. Elena moved quietly, notebook in hand, capturing the subtle distortions. The way shadows moved independently of light, how the fog seemed denser near certain seats, how whispers intensified near frightened passengers. She realized that fear itself was feeding the night, giving it shape and will. Each heartbeat echoed not just in the chest, but through the carriage, harmonizing with the sentient hum of the train. Artyom tried restarting the engines, but the vibrations felt wrong, deliberate, almost communicative. Sparks flared from the wheels striking displaced rails. Jigs formed in the fog, tall, indistinct, impossibly fast. Every movement seemed calculated, synchronized with the passenger's dread. The windy line was no longer just a train. It had become a living test, and the passengers were the subjects. A sudden, gusting wind rattled the windows violently. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the carriage walls, seeming to reach for the frightened occupants. Sasha clung tighter to his mother. Viktor Petrovich muttered numbers under his breath, calculating survival probabilities. Elena sketched diagrams in her notebook, noting the irregular motion of the shadows, their speed, and their patterns. The passengers began to lose track of one another. In the chaos, fleeting glimpses of figures in the fog created panic. Some disappeared for seconds, only to reappear in different positions, dazed, whispering incomprehensible words. Time itself seemed suspended, elongated, as if the world outside the carriage obeyed a different rhythm than reality inside. Artyom's pulse quickened. He had driven countless trains, but none had obeyed fear as this one did. Each vibration of the engine, each groan of the wheels, corresponded to the passenger's terror. The fog pressed closer, thickening, condensing into semi-formed shapes, moving with intent. The train no longer felt like a machine. It was a living entity, sentient, aware of every emotion aboard. Elena looked around at the passengers, faces pale, eyes wide, breaths shallow. Every individual was hyper-aware, unable to ignore shadows or whispers. The psychological weight pressed down like a physical force. Even those who had survived the derailment felt the night closing in, the train and fog conspiring to disorient, to terrify, to separate mind from body. Sasha whispered again, voice trembling, "They're waiting for us." His mother shook her head, but did not remove her gaze from the fog. Viktor Petrovich's hands trembled around the briefcase, sweat beading on his forehead. Sergei clutched a hand-stitched rosary, muttering prayers faster now. Each passenger was trapped, not only by the derailed train, but by the oppressive, sentient night beneath the windows. Time blurred, shadows twisted, whispers surged and receded. Elena documented patterns, realizing the entities outside responded to fear, anticipation, and attention. The train's rhythm had merged with the environment, the passengers' minds, and the fog itself, creating a living, sentient trap. Escape was no longer mechanical. It required understanding, courage, and endurance. The windy line had fully awakened. It was no longer a route or a vehicle, it was a predator, a psychological labyrinth, a force feeding on perception, and all aboard were caught in its grasp. Each heartbeat, each glance, each whispered fear added to its strength. The night was not over. The passengers understood, without words, that survival depended on more than physical ability. It depended on perception, resilience, and the ability to face horrors unseen and unknown. Chapter 7. Facing the horror. Night hides the unseen horrors. The fog thickened further, pressing against the train like a living wall. Shadows outside began to take formal, distorted figures that moved with unnatural grace. Every passenger frenzied at the sight, hearts hammering, breaths shallow. The train trembled under them, as if reacting to the collective fear, a predator aware of the panic within its prey. Artyom gripped the controls with white-knuckled hands. The derailment had left the train unstable, but moving forward was the only option. Every vibration of the wheels, every groan of metal, seemed to echo in the fog, magnifying the tension. Shapes darted along the periphery of vision, vanishing whenever anyone tried to focus on them. The line between reality and illusion was gone. Viktor Petrovich clutched his briefcase tightly. The remaining documents felt heavier than ever, as if imbued with importance beyond comprehension. "We must keep moving," he muttered, voice shaking, though he barely believed his own words. Every shadow outside seemed to react to the sound of his voice, elongating, twisting, waiting. Sasha buried his face in his mother's shoulder. "Mom, they're coming closer," he whispered, eyes wide. His mother could do nothing but nod, gripping him, her own fear silent but palpable. Elena crouched beside them, notebook open, recording every movement, every shift in the fog, every fleeting sound. Her pen scratched frantically, capturing patterns she could barely understand, aware that the entities outside were responding to attention, fear, and observation alike. Sergei, normally composed, was muttering prayers faster, eyes darting to every window. "It's testing us, each of us, individually," he said. "We cannot let it see weakness." His words hung in the carriage like a warning, and the passengers nodded in silent agreement. Survival was no longer a matter of engineering or luck, it was a matter of perception. resilience, and courage. Suddenly, a violent gust rattled the carriage windows, and the shadows outside coalesced into humanoid shapes, impossibly tall, with features blurred and shifting. A low, whispering hum filled the train, vibrating through the floors, walls, and passengers' chests, everyone frowsy. It was a sound that felt alive, sentient, aware of the terror it instilled. Artyom pushed forward, adjusting the throttle. The train lurched violently, almost tipping on the partially derailed tracks. Sparks flew from the wheels, illuminating glimpses of faces, and the faux faces twisted with fear. Some human, some not. Elena's pen shook as she documented the horrifying scene. Every movement outside seemed to correspond with an emotion inside the carriage. Fear fed them. Attention empowered them. Viktor Petrovich tried to rationalize what he saw. It's not real. It cannot be, he whispered, but even he felt the creeping doubt, the undeniable sense that what they faced was beyond an explanation. Shapes lunged in the fog, silent and impossible, retreating only to return with heightened intensity. Sasha's small hand slipped from his mother's. He reached toward a shadow that seemed almost tangible, a figure that twisted and stretched toward him. Elena lunged to grab him, but in that instant, she saw movement behind her, a blur that did not belong, a figure standing impossibly still despite the lurching train. The train groaned, responding violently to the collective terror. The lights flickered, plunging some carriages into complete darkness. Panic surged. Passengers screamed, clutching each other, whispering prayers, attempting to anchor themselves to some shred of reality. The fog outside seemed to thicken, almost alive, almost sentient, curling through broken windows and under doors, wrapping the train in a suffocating embrace. Artyom's hand shook, but he forced himself to focus. He realized that hesitation would feed the entities outside. They moved with intent, testing the passengers, gauging their reactions, adapting to fear. He adjusted the train's movement with purpose, forcing steady motion, trying to regain control despite the surreal chaos. Elena's eyes darted between Sasha, Viktor, Sergei, and the fog outside. She realized that survival depended on understanding the patterns, observing without panic, noticing subtle shifts. Fear must be controlled, not eliminated, but channeled to anticipate the next movement, the next form that might emerge from the mist. Minutes, or was it hours, passed in this suspended reality. The windy line had fully revealed its sentient nature. It was no longer merely a railway or a train. It was a living predator, feeding on perception, anticipation, and emotion. Every shadow, every flicker, every whisper strengthened it. Sasha finally whispered, trembling but resolute, "We have to face them." The words struck the carriage like a signal. The passengers stiffened, realizing that survival demanded confrontation, awareness, and courage. The fog pressed in, thick and silent, but the passengers began to steel themselves. The night waited, the train waited, the windy line watched, and now its prey, humans capable of fear, understanding, and action, was beginning to rise to meet it. Chapter 8. The Awakening of the Line. Night hides the unseen horrors. The fog was no longer just a curtain between worlds, it was alive. It pulsed, breathed, and reached toward the train like a thinking, conscious organism. The survivors, huddled together in the dim light of flickering bulbs, felt its presence pressing against the thin walls of the carriages. Every heartbeat, every breath, every tremor of fear was echoed in the metal under their feet. Artyom stood near the shattered front window, his face lit by the faint, trembling glow of a dying headlamp. "It's reacting to us," he said quietly. His voice was hoarse, almost reverent. "Every move we make, it responds." Elena, sitting nearby, nodded. Her hands trembled as she wrote in her notebook, though her words were barely legible now. "It's not just reacting," she whispered. "It's learning. It understands us." A low vibration began in the floor, soft at first, then stronger, rhythmic, like the pulse of a living heart. The train trembled slightly, though the engines were silent. Viktor Petrovich clutched his briefcase tighter, eyes darting around as if expecting the walls themselves to close in. "This isn't physics," he murmured. "It's something else." Sasha looked toward the window. The fog had thickened into dense, swirling shapes. For a moment, he thought he saw faces, human, yet wrong. Their features stretched and distorted. They seemed to mouth words he couldn't hear, yet somehow he understood. "Stay," the boy gasped and stepped back, pressing against his mother. "They don't want us to leave," Kay whispered. Elena's pen stopped mid-sentence. The words resonated through the group like a truth they'd all been avoiding. The windy line didn't want passengers, it wanted witnesses. It wanted fear. It wanted memory. Suddenly, the lights went out. Darkness consumed everything. For a few seconds, there was only breathing, shallow, terrified, human breathing, and the faint hum of the fog outside. Then a deep metallic groan split the silence. The train shifted slightly, not forward, not backward, but downward, as though something beneath it was moving, pulling. Sasha's mother screamed as her seat jolted upward. The sound of twisting metal filled the carriage. The survivors scrambled, grabbing seats and handles for balance. Outside, the fog glowed faintly red, as if lit by something beneath the ground. Elena's voice rose over the chaos. "It's the line. The ground, it's alive." And then they heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the physical world. A distant wail, metallic yet human, a voice filled with despair, echoing through the fog and steel. It came from below, from the depths of the tracks, resonating through the carriages. Artyom shouted over the noise, "Hold on!" He gripped the control lever, though the train was derailed. It responded, lurching slightly forward. Sparks erupted from the wheels, igniting the fog with ghostly light. Elena saw something in that moment, shapes moving beneath the rails, enormous and serpentine, flowing like liquid shadows. Every scream, every fear seemed to feed them, to make them move faster. The windy line was not built on the earth. It was a scar within it, a living wound that never healed. Viktor Petrovich stumbled, hitting the wall hard. Papers scattered again, some sucked toward the shattered window by a sudden gust. "My God," he whispered, watching as one sheet vanished into the fog, and a moment later, the fog mirrored the paper's fall, twisting it into a shape, a mockery of its form. "It's copying us," he said. "It's mimicking everything we do." Sasha's mother began to pray, her voice trembling. Sergei joined in, clutching his rosary so tightly the beads cracked. The prayer didn't stop the noise, it only changed it. The metallic wail deepened, harmonizing with the rhythm of their words, turning the prayer into part of the nightmare psalm. Elena's eyes widened, It's listening to us, she said. Every word gives it form. Every sound gives it power. The red light outside flickered again, and through the shattered front glass, Artyom saw a form, a face pressed against the fog. Human, but not. Eyes hollow, mouth open in a silent scream. Then, down scenes more appeared, floating, watching, whispering. He slammed his fist against the control panel. You want movement? Fire. The train's broken systems sparked violently. Against every law of mechanics, the wheels began to turn. The carriages shuddered, screeching as they tried to pull free from invisible restraints. The fog roared in protest, whipping into violent spirals. Passengers screamed, clinging to anything solid. As the windy line came alive in full force, the walls vibrated, windows shattered, and the world outside became a blur of red and gray. The train, half derailed, half lifted, surged forward through the impossible landscape. For the first time, the passengers felt something that wasn't fear, it was defiance. Elena stood, bracing herself against the wall, shouting over the chaos. Don't give it what it wants. Don't be afraid. The words spread like fire. Sergei stopped praying and started shouting. Sasha's mother held her son tightly but didn't close her eyes. And even Viktor Petrovich raised his head, staring into the red storm beyond. The fog recoiled. The shakes flickered. The train roared. For the first time, the windy line seemed uncertain, but deep within the red mist, something vast stirred, something ancient, heavy, and alive. The fog wasn't retreating, it was changing, preparing. The line was waking up completely now, aware of the resistance, ready to strike back. And as the passengers held on, racing for whatever came next, Elena whispered the words that none dared to say aloud. This isn't just a line, it's a threshold. The night did not answer, it simply watched and waited. Chapter 9. The Final Stretch. Night hides the unseen horrors. The storm of fog raged around the train like a living tempest. The carriages groaned, metal screamed, glass shattered, and through it all the survivors clung to what remained of reality. The windy lie was no longer just a machine, it was alive, curious, aware, and now it was awakening completely. Artyom stood at the controls, half blinded by sparks and smoke. Every lever he touched burned his hands, but he didn't let go. The train moved impossibly, defiantly through a world that was no longer governed by physics. Outside, the fog pulsed with red veins of light, like the lifeblood of some ancient creature. Elena, he shouted over the noise. We can stop. If we stop, it'll consume us. She nodded, gripping the edge of a seat, her notebook still in hand, pages soaked and torn. Her eyes were wide, not with fear now, but with understanding. It's not the line itself, she yelled back. It's what was buried under it. Her words cut through the chaos. Viktor Petrovich lifted his head, realization dawning in his trembling eyes. The foundation. The old tunnels. They said they sealed them decades ago. Elena's voice cracked. They didn't seal them, they built over them. The railway woke something that should have stayed buried. A thunderous roar answered her words, shaking the train so violently that several seats broke loose. Outside, the red fog split open like a wound, revealing shapes enormous, serpentine forms made of shadow and light, coiling endlessly beneath the rails. They were not creatures in the traditional sense, they were memories, remnants of something ancient, onto the earth long before humans had named fear. Sasha screamed, pointing at the windows. Faces were forming in the mist again, but now they weren't strangers. They were the passengers themselves, reflected in distorted mockery. Every fear, every regret, every secret they'd carried was alive, watching. The boy's mother held him tightly. "Don't look, Sasha, don't look." But Elena looked. She understood now. The windy line wasn't a route or even a place. It was a mirror, a bridge between what was real and what was buried in the human mind. The wreck, the fog, the whispers, all of it fed on memory, guilt, and terror. Artyom fought to keep the train steady as rails twisted beneath them, glowing faintly red. "We can't outrun it," he shouted. "We don't have to," Elena replied. "We have to let go." The others stared at her, not understanding. The fog outside pressed harder, voices rising into an unbearable crescendo. Every whisper now spoke in unison, in human tones that chilled the blood. "Stay with us. Stay. Forever." Elena stepped forward, her voice steady despite the chaos. "It's not asking for our lives," she said. "It's asking for our fear. If we stop feeding it, it dies." Victor shook his head. "That's madness. We'll be torn apart." "Maybe," she answered quietly, "but fear is what keeps it alive, and we've given it enough." The lights flickered once more. The red glow intensified, filling every window. Shapes of impossible scale moved beyond his sight, writhing, roaring. The air itself seemed to hum with hatred and hunger. Elena dropped her notebook to the floor. For the first time since the crash, her hands stopped shaking. She reached for Sasha's mother, for Sergei, for Artyom. "Together," she said, "no fear." The group joined hands, trembling at first, then stilling. The fog wailed, reacting violently, battering the train from all sides. The windows shattered completely, the world outside dissolving into pure red and black light. But the passengers did not scream. They stood in silence, defying it. The windy line howled. The floor vibrated violently, rails cracking beneath. For a moment, the entire world seemed to tear apart, sound, land, and time collapsing into a single deafening instant. And then silence. The red faded, the fog thinned. When Artyom opened his eyes, dawn was breaking. The train Saturday motionless on the rails bent, scorched, but real again. Around him, the survivors stirred, dead but alive. The night was gone. The fog had vanished. The only sound was the wind, soft and almost kind. Elena looked out through the broken window. The landscape was unfamiliar yet peaceful, fields covered in morning frost, a quiet horizon stretching endlessly. There was no sign of the nightmare that had consumed them, only tracks that disappeared into the distance. Viktor Petrovich exhaled, finally releasing his ruined briefcase. Papers scattered across the floor, meaningless now. Sergei closed his eyes and whispered a final prayer, not of fear, but of gratitude. Sasha clung to his mother, silent, eyes fixed on the pale sunrise. Artyom stepped out onto the tracks. The air was cold and clean. He looked down the line, where faint traces of mist still drifted like dying embers. "It's over," he said softly. Elena joined him, notebook in hand. Though its pages were blank now, the ink washed away. She smiled faintly. "Maybe for us," she said, but the line's still there. He turned to her, confused. She looked at the horizon, where the fog was already starting to gather again, faint but visible. The windy line doesn't end, she said. It just waits for the next train. The wind rose soft at first, then stronger, whistling gently through the broken metal. It sounded almost like breath. And far away, deep in the mist, a whistle answered.